Everybody remember what happened in 1985 to curb those high values of dollars? We had the Plaza Accords. So New York City, the Plaza Hotel. Essentially, we had 5 major countries join in. The US, Japan, West Germany. Wasn't even a combined Germany. Gosh, that makes you feel old, doesn't it? France and the UK. That was the first G5. So nowadays we think of it as the G6. For a while it was the G7. The G5 was important because on the outer spectrum, what was happening is interest rates went so high. Everybody wanted to peg their currencies with a high interest rate, so they were buying US denominated bonds, they were buying US dollars. All that purchasing pushed up the dollar, and the US didn't like it. Why? Because that hurts their manufacturing, it hurts their exports. And that thing's gonna be the death of me today. And essentially, as that dollar got stronger and stronger, the US became less and less competitive. So they brought them in. All of those other 4 countries said publicly, no way, we're not going to go ahead and take part in raising our own currencies. We like being competitive. They got behind closed doors and they came out and they said, oh, we're all going to sell our dollars. We've come to an agreement. Think of Hamilton. You know, I want to be in the room where it happened. There's no musical fans in here. Jeez, maybe it's a London thing, right? Come visit London. We've got some beautiful musicals, you know, and they're about America too, so you can't go wrong. So essentially, they devalued just on something that went on behind closed doors. That is something that we have to be very mindful of right now because we had a time period where we had high inflation. The Trump administration has 7 things that economists agree, whether they're Republican or Democrat, that they would be inflationary. Now, what we have to remember is sometimes Trump says things that he doesn't really mean, right? So we have to be mindful that he might be just posturing himself. He might just be full of crap, right? We don't have to sit there and take everything as fact, but there's 7 policies that could be inflationary. Now, the one thing we do know about the Trump administration is he garners the short term of the stock market as whether he's doing a good job or a bad job. So this is why I'm not overtly fearful of the markets, because Trump is not going to put into place all 7 of those functions too quickly if it destroys the stock market. And high inflation in the short term would hurt the stock market. It would recover with time, but it would hurt the stock market. So the typical view on the street is that this is more posturing towards those other countries, just like the Plaza Accords were, to devalue the dollar in some way, shape, or form. When this would happen or how this would happen is one of those big questions out there. But this is to where these are great opportunities for us on an appreciated dollar to be purchasing and diversifying ourselves into different places, different zones, and building our full financial plan in those types of ways. Okay. We're a quiet group. Or is it just because I brought up Trump all of a sudden? It's just silence. We haven't had enough drinks to be, we haven't had enough.
Start with a question, like about mentioning his interest for a higher stock market. How do you see his new interest in cryptos?
Oh, that's opportunistic. You know, he got voters first, then he got himself a couple $1 billion, right? You look back at his old quotes. I mean, cryptocurrencies have 0 fundamental value. Schiller, who was the head economist at Yale, they tell me smart people come from Yale, so therefore I'll listen to him. In his last book, he stated, there's only 2 valuation mechanisms that you can fundamentally get a value for cryptocurrency markets, right? One of them is essentially if you take all of the illegal money in the world and you put it into one place. And the other fundamental valuation would be based on building a Ponzi scheme of introducing it to 6 people and then 6 people more, et cetera, et cetera. And the valuation, and I'm going off memory of a book that I read several years ago, was something between $3 and $5 $5 trillion, right? From my understanding, essentially the highest all cryptocurrencies in the world got was something like 4.8 trillion. Hey, this guy's pretty smart, because what is the fundamental value of it? There is no fundamental value. You have to make a guesstimate. Now, if there becomes a utility on these types of things, we can change our views and change our minds on that. But essentially, our governments have a monopoly in funds for a reason, so that they can print in times like COVID, et cetera, without having to tax when things are at their hardest. If they lose that value to the open markets, now all of a sudden, in the worst of times, they're just going to have to tax to death, and that makes a less efficient marketplace. He's an opportunist on those types of things. We've seen big bubbles come in the past. We'll continue to see them. Look at Truth Social. Just because the president invests in it doesn't make it a good investment. We did that disclaimer yesterday on our economic update, right at the end of the disclaimers, and it completely threw off our analyst because he's used to just reading straight off the page. But we have to think about that for the next 4 years. It is a buyer beware type of environment. They don't mind screwing anybody and everybody. So we should be mindful of those types of things. That all being said, though, the stock market is fine. It's expensive, but it's fine. And why I say it's fine is because essentially, if we look at the S&P 500, we have 70 stocks in there that have expectations of 20% or higher earnings growth. Right? If we're only looking at 10% growth of stocks, we have 70 stocks that can outgrow that. Now, what I'm being careful about is how much I'm allocating towards the Magnificent Seven, or now what are called the Batman stocks, because we've included a few more. But let's just call it the top 10 out of the S&P 500, right? So 490 stocks make up 62% of the S&P 500. 10 make up 38%. So we're almost getting to the square root rule right there. Sorry? Absolutely. Basically, you know who they are because they were in the front row of the inauguration, right? And it's not to say that any of these companies are going to fall apart. A lot of them have turned into monopolies or oligopolies. They're fascinating companies. They have potential growth, but they also have a lot of potential risks of falling apart. In past years, we were worried about the risks of them being subdivided into multiple companies, right? I saw that as a great opportunity because if I could buy Waymo without having to buy Google, that'd be fascinating, right? If I could buy the Amazon cloud services without having to buy their commerce services, I would love that, right? And there's examples all throughout it. If I could buy Tesla without Elon Musk, gosh, it's a dream, right? So we've got to factor that they've got these risks, and the question really becomes, is there 2 times the upside for 1 time the downside? And for lots of them, that might not be the case. So it's not to say that we avoid them completely, but the whole idea of buying the S&P 500 is to diversify ourselves. And if we've got 38% in 10 stocks, we're not as diversified as we'd like to be. Those 10 companies happen to be in the driving sectors. The AI sector, for example. We love the AI sector. Yeah, it's expensive, but it's going to change a lot of things. Any company that's not implementing AI, we were talking about our small companies, what we're implementing from a technological vantage point and how to put them. You know, my team keeps saying it's funny that the old guy's the guy pushing AI in our company the most, which so be it. Now, the thing is, you can invest in AI without having to actually invest directly in AI companies. You can find things that are associated with it. What does AI use a ton of?
Computer chips.
Computer chips is one of them, yeah. Then we're buying an NVIDIA or betting in some of the next ones. Sorry? They do, absolutely. But all of those use a ton of Electricity, exactly. Exactly. Electricity growth is anticipated to be 16% per annum for the next half a decade. Two of the top performing S&P 500 companies were energy companies. And I'm not talking about your Exxons and Chevrons. I'm talking about your utilities, right? So now, when you start talking about that next level, I'm not talking about the ESG, the environmental view of let's build wind farms all over the place. I like that, but it's happening anyways. And the question is whether they're hugely profitable or not. And some years, yes, some years we get a couple of them that have frauds and it all of a sudden ruins the entire bunch. But anything that's involved with integrating the grid becomes something that has exceptionally high growth potential in line with the AI sector, because the more AI grows, the more the grid grows. So this is one of those examples where we can buy something that's correlated to the Magnificent Seven without actually owning the Magnificent Seven. And we love those types of examples because we always have to look for what things make us paranoid. When Patty introduced me, what is my job? My job is to take the blame for anything that goes wrong. So you guys all remember Catch-22, right? Joseph Heller. Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not after me. So when I'm looking at the portfolio, when I'm designing the portfolio, it's never about what are our returns going to be this year. It's what could destroy the portfolio? What could get me blamed for things, right? That's that number one thing. The Magnificent Seven destroys our portfolios because we don't have enough diversification inside of there, so we have to find alternative ways. Right? The other place that we're really loving, small caps. Small caps and mid caps tend to outperform during recessions over large caps. And the beauty is, they're cheaper than large caps right now. And they're in all those same sectors as those large caps. And guess what we're getting with Donald Trump? Tons of deregulation, right? Some of them make sense. I found one that made sense this morning. We've been hearing about it for 20 years. I know. You have to look far, but we want to have a positive tone today, right? One of the number one initiatives of the Doge office is to get rid of the penny. Costs more to produce a penny than it's actually worth. Makes complete sense. We've been talking about this for 25 years. So there is some waste that goes on over there, but essentially they want to get rid of a significant part of the government. Does anybody know who Michael Lewis is? A great author. Some of his movies had Brad Pitt in them and such. He's been writing since the 1980s. He was from London, or no, he's from Berkeley, and then he moved to London, moved back. The first time that we had Trump serving, we also had Rick Perry that was running against Trump. You remember him? Yeah. I'm going to get rid of we're going to get rid of Texas? I like that even better. Nobody's from Texas, right? I didn't say it. Yeah. He was going to get rid of 3 of the major departments, right? Right. But then Michael Lewis started writing a series of articles in Vanity Fair, and you can still find them on Vanity Fair. And they were wonderful. He basically said, Rick Perry wants to get rid of this department, and I have no clue what that department does. And I remember the first article was about the Department of Agriculture. And the Department of Agriculture, he said, we all assume that they basically just subsidize all the farms, because that's what they tell us they do. I can't remember if it was 2 or 3%, but it was single digits of their budget actually went towards subsidizing the farms. The rest of the money was going to all these obscure programs. Well, are they good or bad? So he started investigating it. And he found this group in DC that every Friday they'd have a drinking session. And if somebody named something that the Department of Agriculture did, and you didn't know they did it, you had to drink. And within a very short period of time, they were all completely drunk. And he was learning more about the Department of Agriculture than he could have ever imagined. And there were groups, for example, that every airport has a member of the Department of Agriculture that has a gun, right? It's a federal employee that has a gun to shoot birds that are nesting so that they don't get in the engines. I can't remember what year Scully took that plane down, but it was before they wanted to get rid of the entire Department of Agriculture. And I don't know, they could have been advocating that they want public citizens to have guns inside of the airport, right? The question really needs to be, how many of these need to disappear, right? That's that first part. Now, the second part that we should be concentrating on, the stock market, fine, because the biggest companies, the best companies, are driving new technologies that are making us more efficient. But the actual growth of the country and the stock market are getting decorrelated. Right? Ask most anybody in the middle or lower class. They'll definitely agree with that. Now, the proof is, essentially, does anybody have any idea what GDP estimates are for 2025 in the United States? But it's a significant drop from last year. It's about a 20% drop year over year. Those are the expectations. Part of that's strong dollar. So going back onto that, how long can we have this strong dollar in which it's going to hurt manufacturing and hurt investment? Yeah, he can get his friends in the Saudis to dedicate $600 billion, the friends out in the East to dedicate $500 billion. But how many of those happen, and how many of those are just, we're going to invest this over the course of 20 years, right? So great news stories for that first week, but how much does it impact the movement of the dollar in any way, shape, or form? Now, the other aspect of it that we have to remember, government spending is a big part of all of our GDPs. In the United States, it is 22% of our GDP. Most of that is funded on debt. Cheap debt. Does everybody know what the money multiplier effect is? Okay. Simple premise. If essentially we live in a small town, we're the only ones that are commercial vendors in there. If somebody spends money at my place, I go spend it at the baker spends it at the butcher spends it on, and it reverberates around, right? Now, in an efficient town where everybody is basically middle class, the money multiplier can get up to 32 times. So in 1 year, basically $1 that's given to me can be spent across the board 32 times, which is amazing. Now, in poorer communities, it typically goes down to 7. Wow. Now, the theory would be that in poorer communities, you'll have more chains where the money actually leaves the community, right? If somebody just goes to the national grocery store, the money might be going back to Paris or wherever the headquarters might be instead of staying in the local community. So it doesn't reverberate so much, right? This is why local business, local commerce is so important. But that means when we're borrowing money at 4% and 22% of our GDP goes towards government spending, 22% of government spending is the makeup of GDP. If we shrink the government too much, what would we expect? Our GDP is going to go down. And those individuals are not going to spend that money, and that money multiplier will fall, right? This is why debt is quite cheap. Too much debt is a problem, as the Greeks pointed out. Well, actually, nowadays we can almost say the French pointed it out to us this summer because the pricing got to the same on French and Greek debt. The thing is, different regions have different ways to try to deal with this. This is when I'm going to get heckled a little bit, so apologies. A lot of countries have high thresholds for inheritance tax. My home country in the UK is definitely one of them. A married couple gets £1 million, £1 million of exemption on their inheritance tax. And that's made up of $325,000 each, and then if they own a house, an extra £175,000. So a single person that doesn't have a house only gets 325,000 pounds worth of exemption. It's not too significant, right? Now, essentially, it's not a horrible thing because the majority of the population got rich in the last 30, 40 years. The baby boom generation. Might be a few baby boomers in here. So now, essentially, because the number of baby boomers is the biggest part of our population, 2030 is the beginning of the time frame where they start to pass away. And as they've made the most wealth, if that reverberates back down, it can actually start to pay back some of the debt. 2 years ago, essentially, inheritance tax only made up 2% of the UK's budget. Just last quarter, it went up 0.6 billion, right, to 6.9 billion. So it's starting to eke up 3-4%. We haven't even gotten to the beginning of the threshold of them starting to pass away, which starts in 2030. So this is why inheritance tax is a huge thing that will help European budgets in a big way. Not all of them, because
most of it stuck in the stones, shall we say, stuck in housing.
Some of it, absolutely.
Basically forcing people to sell homes.
It can be, but some countries have answers for that. For example, and I don't know exactly how it works, but I'll give you the basics on it. Germany's plan. This is with their Mittelstand, so the smaller and medium-sized companies that are mostly family-owned. They have a deal where, essentially, if you inherit a family business, you don't pay any inheritance tax until you actually sell the business. Now, that's brought up unintended consequences years later because some of them have some mismanagement because the kids might not have been as good as the adults. I'm not going to name names, but for instance, they've been the slowest to adopt to most technology. It's one of those aspects that, what is the perfect system? I don't know, but it's more to identify that debt is not always horrible if there's a means to pay off that debt, right? So, for example, typically in these presentations, normally Jonathan comes down with me. And if you haven't met Jonathan, you have to listen to one of his webinars.
Jonathan Anita.
Exactly. Now, Jonathan is the most excitable accountant you can get when it comes to U.S. taxes, right? He actually makes the subject very entertaining and very fun. It's funny because most accountants, you're used to them looking at their own shoes. He actually looks you in the eye. It's wonderful. So Jonathan calls the double taxation agreement between the United States and France the bee's knees. Right? Which then I Googled it and I found out that it was a very nice cocktail. And so I still don't understand what he's talking about. No. But essentially, it is this wonderful, wonderful agreement that we get to pay all of our taxes in the United States if that's where the funds originate from. So that being the case, we're better off than the average French person, right? We're better off than if we were in 43 states in the United States. And just as Patty gave the example of Adrian getting all of these services in the French medical system, we're better off than having to pay the US medical system, right? So we're getting a lot of benefits there, but we get the negative ramifications of high estate taxes. So for any of you that haven't moved over here just yet, if estate taxes are important, it's not to say don't come, it's to say make sure you have deep conversations with your notary before you buy a place to structure it in the right format. Make sure before you move over here that if you have the means to make any gifts to get them out of your estate, that you do so. Before you come. If you've moved on to French soil, there's high restrictions on how many gifts you can give. The third aspect is if you're giving your money to charity, it's in the double taxation agreement. You're golden. You don't have to worry about any of it.
Excuse me, I'm interrupting.
Please.
Adrian, so you're suggesting that any kind of beneficiary that you have listed in your portfolio, that you have to adjust that before coming here? Is that what you're saying?
No. Well,
Brian, can you repeat the question because you're on mic and she's not?
okay. So you're asking if you have a beneficiary on there, you have to change it before you move here. No, I'm actually saying if you're going to be giving a gift to one of your kids, give the gift before you move over here.
I've done that.
So that essentially it is completed and they're only looking at a lower set of assets, right? These are those good ways. Now, essentially, the best way to avoid an inheritance tax in France, or spend it. Spend it, enjoy it, right? Spend it, gift it away, etc. Is the most important part. That is the only drawback about living in France. So I jump on that right off the bat so that you don't have to raise your hand, just interrupt.
Quick question about that. So, do we have to be here 5 years in order for that to apply, or does it happen right away as we move in?
Repeat the question.
So you're asking, do you have to be here resident for a period of time before that applies? And no, that's not the case. Once you become resident, you're resident, right? Once you're in the French system and considered resident, they will actually consider your domicile here, and therefore your estate will clear here.
Information on my money. That's what it is. So as soon as I move here, they will have all the information of what I have in the States.
So you're asking if once you move here, do they get access to all it? No, you actually give them all the information, because even though the double taxation agreement between France and the United States states that you only pay the tax in the US if all your income originates in the United States, you still have to file in France. So that's the number one rule. Anytime you ask, and I'm not a tax accountant, but I'll play one here. Anytime you ask the question is, do I have to report this? The answer is always yes, to both sides. All income, all accounts. So the French are going to know about all of your accounts because you're going to tell them about all of your accounts, right? That's the important part. And then essentially, you sadly pass away. They go down to the notaire and they disclose the balance sheet, and that's how they tax it.
Brian, one thing you might want to point out on inheritance tax is if you've moved here but maintained assets, cash or tangible, in the States, those are taxable under French inheritance taxes.
Absolutely.
Make sure everyone knows.
Absolutely. It is a great point.
You can't hide it in the U.S. and not have it taxed.
Absolutely. It's a great point that essentially all they're saying is all of our assets globally are going to fall into your inheritance tax here in France.
So then you, not that I care,
But you
because
will
I'm
be dead.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I'll actually quote. I'll quote a book from back in the 1970s. Has anybody ever heard of the book The Millionaire Next Door? Horrendous read, but so many interesting parts of it, right? And it was all these consultants with that were consulting Merrill Lynch that were trying to figure out what the best demographic was to work with, et cetera. And one part showed that the more you left in inheritance to the next generation, the less likely they were to succeed, right? Now, essentially, the economists have dubbed this the Paris Hilton effect, right? In other words, the people that have all of the abilities because they have access to education, any type of experience that they could ever have the least amount of ambition because they have the most amount of money, right? So just have that in the back of your mind of what legacy are you really wanting to live. Spend it.
Brian, are you saying that in addition to the inheritance tax that France will impose after my death, because we have inheritance taxes in the U.S. if I leave assets there? No. In that case, I'm going to have, not me, somebody's going to be paying inheritance tax times 2.
That's a great question. So what you're asking is, if I pass away here in France, will I still be subject to inheritance tax in the U.S.? So the first answer is, I really hope so, but most likely not. Most likely because you'll be able to offset all the French taxes against anything that's due in the U.S. In the U.S., right now we have a $13.99 million exemption per person, so a married couple can double that up by means, which means it's just shy of $28 million. but you're going to offset all those French taxes. So why I say I hope so is because, well, if you have that type of wealth, there are different ways to shelter different pieces. I won't waste our time on that because essentially it's dealing with a couple scrupulous individuals, and they live that way and that way, but not here. So essentially, if you get to that level, well, it's a good problem. But no, you're not subjected to both. One offsets the other.
Right. But don't
One second.
underestimate the French tax system's willingness to go after assets and look for things. I mean, they will. Johnny Hallyday, the famous French singer, he moved to L.A. a little while before he died because he thought he was going to be able to
Get out of it.
From the tax system in France for his heirs, and I think his heirs are still fighting that battle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's always going to be cross-border issues. Luckily, most of us are Americans that are coming this way, so we're actually doing it knowingly. Yes?
There might be others in this scenario who have the American French in their family. So I'm American, my parents are American, and I'm a naturalized Frenchie.
Okay.
And so then what happens? So if American parents have children who are then French American.
Well, are the parents in the States or are the parents here?
Yeah, they're American,
Yep.
and they're doing the 6 months.
They're not tax
Still
resident
America, I
France.
guess. So they need to keep still America all the way till the end.
So it really, it goes deep into the weeds right there, right? Because essentially, if they were just considered American, right? If everything clears through the American system, there's a double taxation treaty just for estate taxes, not even the regular double taxation treaty. Therefore, it's taxed in America. But if the French deem them to be resident here, which isn't necessarily just, we stayed 6 months and under, right? The determination is very subjective. So the sad thing on subjective things, because I think the legal interpretation is where you lay your head and where you do your business. Well, if you're retired, well, where are you really doing your business? It's all subjective. So all of a sudden it becomes getting a legal representation of what that position should be is the safest way to determine it.
So do the French will, or is that separate?
No, to determine whether there's actually an issue. They might look at their exact situation and say, well, as long as you don't stay 6 months and a day, there's nothing else that would jump in to make them French resident. But I don't want to sit there and say in a public manner that there's not other ways.
How the French look at it could depend on whether they are here on a long stay visa.
Absolutely.
That considers them a resident. And
Absolutely.
If they're applying to be on the French healthcare system.
Absolutely.
So you have to repeat that.
Absolutely. Oh.
This is being recorded.
Absolutely. As Patty points out, there's a lot of determinations, like whether somebody is on a long-term visa, whether they're in the healthcare system here in France, etc., that could actually push them into being considered French resident, right? We used to have this chart when we relied on PowerPoints. Now we lazily don't put them together, which just showed all the different countries in the world, and how the richer they become, the more factors they get into to grasp on our wealth, right? The richest country in the world, United States, what do we have? We have citizens-based taxation. Don't worry, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then, essentially, the UK, all of a sudden we have a domicile system. Most everybody else has a residency-based taxation system, right? So, all of a sudden, as countries get richer and richer, right, they start to find ways that you can actually find extra income and grasp it from other jurisdictions, right? As people shift more and more, I'd expect more and more ways that they're going to find to do that. Except for right now, don't worry, I'll get to your question in a second. Right now, has everybody seen that Damien LaHood from Illinois has put together a bill to go to residency-based taxation instead of citizens-based taxation? We will give you some good news from Washington. Does anybody know what the WEP is, the windfall elimination provision? The good news is it's gone, so you don't ever have to really learn it. So for any of you that worked your entire life in the United States, you were never subject to it anyways. But any of us that worked part of our life in the U.S. and part of our life outside of the United States, there was this provision for Social Security that basically said, you will have a WEP reduction of your Social Security. And the problem is, you will not see that reduction until you start taking Social Security unless you calculate it by hand. Right? So unless you know about it, essentially you're going to get a statement saying you're going to get $3,000 a month, and then they start sending you $2,600 a month, and you're basically going, what's that? And they go, the WEP.
Can you say what WEP stands for?
Windfall Elimination Provision is what WEP stands for. Now, this was one of the last bills that Biden signed before he left office. So a nice elimination. It just means anybody that worked for the railroads, worked in any international capacities, and paid into a different pension will not be subject to that. And somehow in the bill, it's going to actually include a refund for 2024. How that's going to work, I don't know. We haven't really seen it. But that means several of you can think about planning to move abroad in a more simplistic way.
So can that be changed when Trump now comes in? Sure. Like the first thing he did was get us out of the Paris Climate Affair?
Okay, as much as they like to talk about ripping up a lot of the different forms of the government, I don't think he wants to take money out of retirees' pockets because it's not going to help him at the midterms in 2 years. So I don't see why. First of all, it's not really on his purview. I don't think he cares, right? He still has to end the war in Ukraine on the first day, right?
Still waiting on that.
Social Security on the U.S. system. A lot of fun things as an expat. First of all, make sure. I'm a big fan, I'm going to love this because I know that Patty and Adrian have a different view on this. So I want you to chime in with your guys' different view on it. No, it's not one way's right or one way's wrong. It's just making you aware of how you're doing your financial plan. You can receive your Social Security in your French bank account in euros. They will charge nothing for the conversion. Now, essentially, I'm hugely in favor of this because it erodes fees in different ways. It reduces those fees to zero. No bank's going to charge zero. The banks charge a lot. The currency conversion companies, like Money Corp or Wise or any of those, they charge smaller fees. And then it's the level of fees based on what service level you're getting. I believe that if you're spending money on a monthly basis, you just average it out. So you're going to get these average prices each month. Adrian sometimes believes, okay, let it accumulate in the US and then time it to get it over. If you're watching the currencies and you want to have some fun, Adrian's right. If essentially you just want it to come over at the cheapest price possible, I'm right. There's not a right or wrong way. It's build your plan to fit your needs, but you have to call them, right? You ask them, can I have this in euros? Can I have it into my French bank account? No problems there.
Can you have it one way one year and one way another year, or once you lock in one direction, that's it?
Yeah, you can change it because they're always just going to give you the spot rate. So yeah.
Call the Social Security Administration. Is that who you call?
The Social Security Administration has an actual team that deals with anybody that's abroad. They're based in Ireland. They're lovely, and even better, they don't have Irish accents because they're from the United States. That's not a knock on Irish accents. It's just sometimes hard to do business with an Irish accent. Oh, that's right, because you can now get, I'm sorry, you're right, Patty. You can now get on there when you have a foreign address. For years, you couldn't. You used to have to go straight through the office.
Go to the Federal Benefits Unit in the U.S. Embassy, or the U.S. Embassy in Paris. Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
You can also just download the form, because I and send it in last year.
Absolutely.
And you mail it to Paris. Yeah, exactly. And it happens very, that's what you do.
Perfect Google search right on there, Social Security Administration Paris, and you'll get the documents right there. Patty, we're going to get you a desk because you totally forgot that.
I'm French Google, that's all I can say.
Yes.
I just did that where I did the Social Security payments, and I had it transferred over to an out of the States company. But anyway, I thank you for saying that about having it just go to your bank. Social Security, ssn.gov or whatever, you can do it right there online.
Exactly. So yeah, you can go directly online nowadays. I think it was just last year that they finally switched it over. So I'm still stuck in the old age that you had to call up and do it all manually if you lived abroad. They're making it easy on you guys because.
Can I add to that too, Brian?
Yeah.
The deposits always come on the 3rd of the month.
The deposits always come on the 3rd of the month.
Versus in the U.S., you get them at different times of the month.
Right. So you don't get the election to get them anytime. You always get them on the 3rd of each and every month. When you're playing with Social Security, anybody that's not married can just ignore this part. The only way you can game the system, unless you know when you're going to pass away, is if you're married. Okay? This is really easy when you have an older husband, younger wife, right?
Or vice versa.
Well, it's easier with husband being the older because essentially men pass away before their wives. Historic. What? I'm just going based on the actuarial charts. I'm not trying to be. Come on, of all the controversial things I've said, I finally give something that's truly factual, and then you guys are gonna lay into me. Well, I'll tell you afterwards over a drink, but I'm not saying that on mic. So if let's say you have a husband that was the breadwinner, younger wife, they're gonna pass away sooner. The wife can capture the husband's Social Security after death, right? So, easy strategy there. Husband takes their Social Security as late as possible, wife takes hers as early as possible. That's the only way that you can play with their actuarial charts and statistically benefit from it, right? So if you can make those numbers work, that's the way to play with those. Now, naturally, that's one scenario that's on the extremes of those typical things. But essentially, if you ask the question, when should I take my Social Security? You should get your financial advisor to look you in the eyes and say, when are you going to die? Right? You can use family basis, you can use your health, etc. But it's just increasing your probability of being right. Of when you're going to die? No, I'm not repeating that question.
I reached a point where the variance, by the time I turned 80, between taking it early and taking it full retirement age, the total difference by then was $20,000. So it was worth it for me to take it earlier because in the whole scheme of things, I'd rather have the money now than $20,000 extra later.
It's
that's why we retired early. Yes, right.
It plays on those scenarios because, oh, jeez. Okay, so Patty has a list that essentially is a bucket list of all the things that she's going to knock out. And then at that point in time, she's no longer taking Social Security. That was what you said, right? Yeah. Now we're just going to figure out what everything is on the bucket list. So Social Security is one part. But we always talk about having a 4-pillar retirement strategy. Right? Social Security is one of them. Your old retirement accounts. Back in the United States, that's another one. So those old 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, anything else that might be there. The nice thing, fully in the double taxation agreement. For any of those that are still working, you can still contribute over here if you're on the credit system. Make sure you're on the credit system, because if you're on the foreign earned income exclusion, you're going to get a 6% penalty and you're going to have to pull it out, right? If you don't know what I'm talking about there, pull me aside and basically we'll get on the phone with your accountant and it will be either yes or no, right? But don't do it unless you're on the credit system. So you can still contribute to that U.S. retirement account and you can still let that move up.
Is that just in France or is that all
I'm going to specifically say for France, it's a great opportunity because taking it out in France is great. There's countries where it's horrible to take out money out of an IRA, so you want to try to get that money out in those ways. So for instance, like Belgium, you have to take your whole 401k out as one lump sum to get the lower tax in Belgium. Otherwise, it becomes part of your earned income. So, Germany, not attractive to take it out, it becomes earned. So there's a lot of places where it's not that attractive, but it's not exactly. So you can do it in other places. If you were going back to the States for retirement, then you can do it any place. But essentially, France is very attractive, right? So essentially, when it comes to these retirement accounts, one thing to really consider is what your tax bracket is back in the States. And if you have it all in traditionals, you might want to convert some of those to Roths. So going from tax deferred over to tax free could potentially optimize your tax over your lifetime, right? Now, again, this is playing with when am I going to pass away, or these are going to be the benefits for my next generation. But remember earlier we were complaining about estate tax, right? One easy way to reduce the size of your estate is to prepay your taxes, because now you have a smaller estate. So if you have an estate tax problem and you want to deal with it, try to optimize and get into those Roth IRAs. Again, playing with the French system, playing with those higher taxes to go ahead and control that, because then the next generation will at least inherit something that's tax-free instead of just tax-deferred.
So, Brian, these are questions you can help with, or is this a Jonathan?
Both of us.
Both of you?
Both of
Okay.
us.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we can both play with those types of things. But bigger aspect is just make sure you're aware of these types of opportunities and types of things to play with. So that's our second pillar. So we have our Social Security, we have our retirement accounts. The third pillar is the ever important real estate. Now, in America, we don't consider real estate one of our pillars, right? We can have 90-year-olds, 100-year-olds with mortgages. Fannie Freddie will underwrite it, so go ahead and give them a mortgage.
You got the credit score, you got the loan.
They don't think about real estate that way here in France. They think you're retired, you should have less payments, therefore you should have it paid off, and that's one of your pillars to retirement. Might be an annoyance in how you think about, oh, how am I going to buy a property down here? But it reduces your costs over that course of time in a big way. And that gives you an opportunity, again, like we were saying, how you structure your real estate. If you buy a property down here and then you start talking to Adrian and Patty about how should I have structured that, it's too late. Right? You're going to have to pay for it again. You want to have those conversations before you get into the property if estate planning is something that's important. I won't go too deep into Adrian and Patty's territory because Patty's here to ask all those questions for just one measly glass of wine. She'll answer anything you want. 2 glasses of wine, she'll answer it honestly.
In 1982, Margot, that glass of wine.
Thank you, Ella.
So now we have 3 pillars. The 4th pillar is personal savings. Again, taxable in the United States. So you have all those wonderful attributes. Now, there's all kinds of problems and opportunities there. So, essentially, first of all, most of your brokerages will not accept a U.S. address. I'm sorry, a French address. Okay? Fidelity, Schwab, Wells Fargo, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, none of them will allow you to be down here in France with a French address. Now, okay, I'm ignoring that. Sometimes they make exceptions for people they really like, but for the most part, if you call them on a one-off, they won't allow it. Now, there's other brokerages that do allow French addresses. The big one that we utilize a lot is Interactive Brokers. They've got some things that are good that go about with them and some things that are bad. Our robo-advisor, DF-Direct, allows all French addresses.
Is that some kind of regulatory requirement, or is it just better company preference?
So the question is that some kind of regulatory requirement, which I'm going to translate into, I'm sorry, I'm going to bore you guys to death for 2 minutes. There's no regulatory requirement that doesn't allow them to actually do business here in France. It's an interpretation of how things work, right? The major thing that's different between the 2 jurisdictions, if I asked you what the disclaimer is on any investment, would you guys know what it is? It's similar to what's on your mirror in the United States on the side of your car. Past performance is not indicative of future returns, right? Items in your rearview mirror may appear larger than they are in real life, right? So in the United States, if you ask me, hey, VU, how does it perform? I'd say to you, over the last 10 years, it's made 10.5%. And you'd say, but what do you think it's going to do in the next coming years? Over the last 10 years, it's performed 10.5%, right? I'm not allowed to make projections going forward. I can say, based on past returns, we would expect that in these types of environments, it would do this, but it is disclaiming that, hey, that's not accurate, that's not a forward projection. MiFID rules, so MiFID is the European regulatory body overwatching all of the investment sector, essentially states that every fund that's sold needs to have an anticipated return based on its risk level. So one rule conflicts with the other, okay? Now, why can I sell these types of investments, but say a big institution doesn't? Well, it's simple. We have all of the statements on the US side, so that we're conforming with all the US rules, and when I package them together, I'm representing them under the European rules. So I anticipate this group of funds to make 8% each year going forward based on that risk parameter over an average time period. Now, if you go self-directed at Fidelity, they can't do that for every investment, right? Because one rule would be breaking the other, and they're not packaging them up. They're letting you buy each individually. So if somebody's licensed in France and licensed in the United States, and they represent it in that way, you can conform with two rules. But Fidelity, Schwab, Merrill Lynch, that's not what they're wanting to do. They want to keep their licenses separate. So it's not a law, it's just two rules that conflict, and a big institution struggles to think, oh, this room is a great big market. They're thinking the United States is a great big market and France is a great big market, but Americans in France is a small market for them. Does that answer the question? Did I lose like half the room on that? I promised to bore you with that answer. That's why I skip over it. Now, Interactive Brokers, how they get around it, because you guys can open up an account directly on Interactive Brokers. It's a little bit cumbersome because it's quite a tech platform. Yeah. Now, one of the problems with Interactive Brokers is if you open an individual account there, their interpretation is that it should be conforming with French rules, and that means that it should only be allowed to buy individual stocks and individual bonds. So if you want to buy the S&P 500, you have to buy 500 stocks instead of being able to just buy VU or SPY. Now, we've got a trading team, et cetera, so we don't worry about that particularly because we're able to get tons of advantages. I think we had 60 stocks last year in the S&P 500 that actually had negative returns, even though the S&P 500 was up 30%. So if we would have owned all individual stocks, guess what? We can just cherry pick them, sell the losses, and use those, carry them forever forward to offset future gains. Right? So there's opportunities with doing that. And we also get to reduce the fees because we don't have that ETF fee. So we can play with those opportunities. But if it's a $50,000 account and you have 500 securities in there, ooh, that's cumbersome, right? It's going to be a nice thick statement.
Does the way they're going to be taxed in France have anything to do with which brokerage?
Well, they're all going to, as long as you hold it in a brokerage. The question is where you hold the funds going to affect how it's taxed in France? Absolutely, absolutely. That's why we want to use a brokerage that's got a 1099 in the United States. If it's held in the United States, then that's how it's viewed in the double taxation agreement, that it should be taxed in the United States.
In the United States while you have a French address.
Absolutely, absolutely. So essentially, if you go down to your French brokerage and you buy individual securities, most of them won't let you do it, but essentially it's a little bit harder to get your accountant to say, well, these are really US Citus assets, even though I just bought Amazon over here. Now, I'm not the accountant, so I'm not the one that actually files it. You're going to get some accountants that will say, well, Amazon's US Citus, so therefore, even though it's in a French account, it should be taxed in the US instead of here. But you'll get just as many that will say, nope, French account, it's in France, right? So before you pick your brokerage, it's not a question to me, it's a question to the person that's filing your tax return. If I open this brokerage account at this institution, will you be able to consider that U.S.? Okay.
The financial institutions and the type of investment as well. Because through, let's say, Fidelity or wherever in the U.S., you can buy European stocks as well.
Yes, but there's different interpretations of this, right? So once again, I can give you my opinions or how I've seen tax accountants do it, but I've seen just as many tax accountants do it in a different way. If you buy an exchange-traded fund on the New York Stock Exchange that buys in European equities, right, is that a European asset or a U.S. asset, right? That is one of those questions that essentially we've never actually seen that go to the French courts. So I've seen tax accountants do it both ways. It's not saying one's right or one's wrong. I'll tell you once we have a court case and we can say, that is exactly how they interpreted it. The thing I can tell you is we got our interpretation from a firm that's been around since the 80s. We've been around for 14 years. I called them the last time I got that question, it was about 6 months ago from a friend of ours. And it was a tax accountant. He said, have you ever seen this problem? So I called my friends that we built the interpretation on. And I'm able to say since 1980, we've never seen any struggles where they've interpreted it in a different way, right? That's the information I can give you, because
Yeah, we were advised if we didn't want to be liable on tax in France on those to sell them before moving.
it's not wrong. I've just never seen anybody chase for it the other way. You know, it's how strict you interpret the legal code.
Their appetite for trying to find every single dollar.
100, but here's the thing. They're used to Americans coming in and saying, yeah, here are all my accounts. I'm worth X amount of money. All my income comes from the States. I owe you zero in tax. They're used to that. That's very typical. That's just how the tax code works. So that's to where you pick your battles is what it really comes down to. That's why I'm glad Jonathan's passionate about the tax part, because as you see, I'm not that passionate about it. It's just that's how I've seen it work, and it is what it is. We also have our robo-advisor, DF Direct. We just introduced it this year, and it works perfectly in France, which is wonderful, because it means that anybody, any age, can go in at no minimum. You can put $50 in there on a French account, and you're able to buy the exchange-traded funds. So you're able to get the diversified portfolio, our full portfolio, and you can do de minimis shares. Pretty soon, you'll actually be able to send in euros and be able to see the account in euros. Right now, it's just a dollar-based system, so you have to send it through Wise. So essentially, the good news is you're not stuck only using full financial planners if you want to do things yourself and you just want somebody to manage the portfolio in a way that's appropriate for Europe, right, for France. You can use your French address. You don't have to use a friend's address back in the States. You don't have to worry about, am I going to get hit with state income tax or whatever it might be because a 1099 went to the state in California or New York. It's fully compliant in those ways. And there's also a couple other brokerages that are just a little bit more expensive. And so it's not that they're bad or anything. It's just I'm cheap. That's why I built a robo-advisor. So make sure don't sit on a bunch of cash, right? We've had a couple years where we've had high inflation, and everything has a risk. I understand the stock market's going to go up and down. Over the course of time, it goes up. But if we sit on cash, inflation is going to eat into it. Does everybody know the rule of 72? These are those silly math tricks that you do. If you take 72 and you divide it by whatever rate of return you expect, that's the number of years it will take you to double your money. All right? So it works with inflation in inverse. Average inflation, does everybody know what it is? 2.9. Oh, that's very accurate. Over the last 100 years, we'd basically say, you said 2.9, which is the current inflation rate. But if we said the last 100 years, we'd say it averages 4%. If we exclude the 1970s, basically, we'd say it averages 3%. I'm just going to round up just to make it easier to do the numbers. If we take 72 divided by 4, that'd mean every 18 years your ability to spend that cash would be cut in half if it's just sitting in the bank, right? At 3%, essentially, it comes down to every 24 years, right? So doesn't matter which one it is, that's devastating to your lifestyle if you lose half the earnings power. Who cares that it didn't have any volatility in there? You lost that ability to spend it. And we really see that in years like last year where inflation was really high. So don't let it's complex to invest as an American abroad get in the way of making sure that you're getting a return on your investments. You can have them in every single different access point. How are we doing on time, Patty?
Good.
Okay, perfect.
You've gone above and beyond.
Since we're not really here, we're not doing bad on time.
No, you've gone above and beyond, Brian.
I'll open it up to all you guys, and we can order a second round of drinks, and we can just have a little party. I don't have my flight until 8 o'clock, so let's have a good old time. Yeah.
You didn't say anything about
Bahans. So, okay. Once again, I'm just going to bore the entire room, so apologies on that. Okay, so we said earlier, Trump has 7 policies that. Well, okay. Let me start off on a little bit of background history. We talked about the Plaza Accords, etc. Interest rates went skyrocketing. Your parents will remember having 12% mortgages. You guys are all too young, right? 18%. We're having a bidding war over here of who had the highest mortgage rate. Since 1982, basically interest rates have gone one direction, which is down, right? That all kind of ended 2 years ago when inflation went through the roof. And how did we react? Best way to actually curb inflation is to raise interest rates. So I believe the Federal Reserve raised interest rates 7 times. Now, bond values are inversely correlated with interest rates. So think of a teeter-totter or a seesaw or however you were raised. I know we've got some Canadians in the back. You guys say it the English way, right? So think of that inverse relationship. Interest rates go up, bond values go down. The further you are from the fulcrum, the higher they shift, right? So a couple years ago, we took all of our bonds, which we only had a 7-year duration on, and we went as short as possible because we had an inverted yield curve. Short-term interest rates were higher than long-term interest rates. Bearish sign. Right? We had 2 20% years on the stock market when we had bearish signals in the market, which is all coming from that bond market because it's an inverted yield curve. Now, all of a sudden, interest rates started to move down, and we were able to go longer term. Until all of a sudden, the risk came about of these 7 factors that Trump presents that could be inflationary. The market then basically sucked that out. So that's why we saw bonds drop in value significantly, because it became apparent that Powell's words changed a little bit. They started to become more of we have to wait for the information to come out. We'll see if we reduce interest rates. It was no longer, we're going to reduce interest rates in a significant way. And that's to where we have to really watch it for the new year. We are still shortening our duration on our portfolio. We don't want to be as long as possible. If interest rates go down, there's between 20 and 30% upside on 30-year bonds, on the value of them, right? That's just if we get back to where we were before. I tend to think that that's not going to happen. I tend to think that we're going to have to stay higher for longer. You know, essentially it's Plateau Mountain. We're stuck there for a while. So the returns that we're going to get on our bonds will most likely be closer to whatever the yield is on the bonds. 4.25%, some 4.5%. That's not horrible to balance out and to act as a barbell on our portfolio. But would I want to be in a 100% bond portfolio at 4.25% when inflation averages 2.9? Not particularly, because we're only making a 1% rate of return when we have the potential risk of much higher inflation if he's unsuccessful at curbing people's fears on those types of things. So it's not me saying that the bond market is in a horrible place. It's attractive. I love it compared to looking at 2% bonds for all those years, where essentially we always called the stock market the Tina trade. There is no alternative, right? So now we do have that alternative, but we don't want it to be too big of a part of the portfolio. There's a lot of stocks that we would prefer to individual bonds, but we want to balance it out. The way we've been hedging some of our bonds is on the other side buying commodities. Now, AllianceBernstein had a report about a month ago that essentially said if we go into recession, essentially commodities would drop about 5 or 6%. But if we stay out of recession, they could jump up 45%. Buy the wine now before it's 45% more expensive, right? Well, it's France. They dumped, what, $200 million worth of, or 200 million euros worth of barrels of wine? What are you guys doing? Come on. Help the farmers, help the farmers. So essentially, if we have all that upside, if we basically stay out of recession, that would be the biggest risk, that interest rates go up, and we can go ahead and barbell some of that risk in bonds by buying those commodities with little downside risk. So we only have to have 1/8 exposure to actually offset it 1-to-1. So it's playing with the overall portfolio to see how risk should be maintained in the overall thing. It's not we love one asset class and hate the other. I tend to think that at any time, remember, my title at the firm is the guy to blame. Right? 10% of my portfolio, the clients are awesome because they pick those, right? 80% are too boring to talk about. And 10% was, what was Brian thinking? Right? That is a well-balanced portfolio. That's the simplicity of having diversification inside of a portfolio. And that's why I look at things in that way of, I want to avoid those biggest risks because I can't have that bigger than 10%, because then it becomes, Brian, you're fired. Right?
Fire yourself.
Brian, will that be liquid money? Let's say you invested here, because we think about being able to cash out whenever we need it. We have, I know we have Social Security, and if we cannot have fidelity in the U.S., can we have fidelity in the U.S. if I keep an address in the U.S.?
Oh, okay, so we've got legal questions of, can I go ahead and use a U.S. address if I don't live there? I'm not a lawyer. I don't try to play one, but I'll give my interpretation. If you lie to a company about where you live, you've lied to a company about where you live. And therefore, in their policies and procedures, it probably says you're stating that you're telling us the entire truth. Have you broken their rules? Yes. Have you broken the law? No. Now, essentially, in my mind, there's solutions to where we don't have to lie about our address. So those, like I was saying, you can set up your own account on Interactive Brokers and you can buy things, or you can go through a financial advisor like myself, or there's several others. I think there's about 20 different firms that deal with American expats. So it's not me saying, you have to work with me, I'm the only one. It's saying there's plenty of ways that you can get those investments going and keeping them on the U.S. side. When clients don't mind you using a U.S. address, I'm not sitting there saying, oh, you're going to get in trouble, oh, it's the end of the world. I've never heard anybody get in trouble for it except for one thing, right? So just don't do this one thing. If you're registered in a state that loves to tax, they're going to get a 1099 statement stating that you earned interest. It's very hard to say to the state of New York, when they get a bank statement saying you made this much income with that New York address, I didn't live in New York, right? It's not saying that you're going to owe that money. You might get it back, but you're going to have to fight them to not have to pay it because the evidence is right there, right? So the easy way to get out of that, register with somebody in the 7 states that have no state income tax, right? I'm not saying that that's not a problem. I'm just saying That's the only problem that I've seen in the past years. I've disclaimed I'm not a lawyer, so that's not legal advice. It's literally me just saying, don't get scaremongered to think, oh my goodness, I can't have it on a U.S. address. It's not optimal, but essentially that's the only time I've heard problems about it is when somebody has state income tax that they start going after them. New York and California are the ones that you hear about the most often. Right. That shouldn't be a surprise. We know New York, we know California, what they like to go after.
So when you mentioned Roth IRA, okay, because if I have money from your company and that 401k transfer into an IRA, right? I did not want to put it into a Roth IRA because why pay the government my interest in advance? That's the way I look at it. So if it is, I didn't know how the economy was going to be going, and I said right now I might be paying them a lot of tax because I want to convert into Roth IRA so I don't have to pay them later on.
Mm-hmm.
But if I do want to invest here, and you say I can invest in a Roth IRA here,
Yep.
or do you mean to keep the money there?
No, you still keep. So the question is, if I wanted to convert my 401k over to an IRA and then an IRA over to the Roth IRA, would I be keeping that in the United States or would I be moving it to France? Right? Any retirement account that's a U.S. retirement account is going to stay in the United States. Right? So it's in the U.S. jurisdiction. So again, back to Jonathan's comment, the French double taxation agreement, the bee's knees, as long as we keep it in the U.S. So yes, any of those services, the Roth IRA is going to be. You can move your money out of Fidelity. You have, when you were in the United States, you had full flexibility to move it out of Fidelity. It's not Fidelity's money, it's your money. And you can move it from any IRA to another IRA. And essentially, it's easy as anything. You just transfer. Absolutely. That's a company decision, not there's no rules or laws that keep them from doing it. It's their interpretation and where they want to do business. So it's another one of those stories that you hear constantly where banks say, because of the law, we can't do business. And it's like, the French banks, typically, you get a phone call from somebody saying, oh, the French banks won't let me invest. And you're like, I just want to talk to those guys and say, change how you're forming the statement. Say, it would be against your benefits for us to allow you to invest with us. And then all of us would be going away saying, wow, those French bankers are good, honest, they're fiduciaries, they're after our interests, and thank goodness they didn't let me invest in PFIX or end up getting taxed in France instead of the United States. The fact that you can't invest with the French banks is so good, right? So don't be scared off by that.
So if I invest in a French bank, will I still, on my earnings, will I be taxed in the U.S. because I am a retiree here in France and we have that treaty, or will I pay my tax?
So the question is, if you invest in a French bank, will I be taxed in the U.S. according to the double taxation treaty? So the answer to that is, that goes into the weeds of how tax treatment is. So I'd leave that more for, Jonathan or such. But essentially, you're pushing yourself out of the box of the easy element of it's at a U.S. institution, therefore it's taxed in the U.S. Remember how earlier I was saying, oh, if you buy a European security inside of a U.S. account, well, you could interpret it either way because it doesn't specify it in the double taxation treaty. It's not to say one's right and one's wrong, but I've never seen anybody get in trouble for it, right? So it doesn't mean somebody in the future can't get in trouble for it. But essentially, if it's at a French institution, it's more likely that whoever's doing your taxes is going to say, no, that's French income. It should be taxed in France, right? And I'm not the guy that makes those judgments. I don't want to go to school for that. So.
I have an ignorant question. If I had a financial advisor or I have in the United States who has invested, and I move here, do I need to get one that knows the things here versus keeping it there?
That is not an ignorant question at all. That is the best question we've had all day. So the question is, if I have a financial advisor back in the States, do I need to look for a financial advisor that understands the French system, or can I stay with my financial advisor back in the States? The answer is very simple. It depends. All right? Now, here's what I found is sometimes in simple situations, if you know everything corresponds and you know how to do your taxes, et cetera, you might want to keep it with the person that's you've dealt with for all those years because they understand the bigger implications of the financial plan. They know your kids, or they know how the money was accumulated, et cetera. They know you, right? Because let's be honest, a financial advisor is as much a psychologist as they are somebody that deals with money. So therefore, it could give you a lot of peace of mind. If you have a little bit more complex situation, then having somebody that understands the US and French agreements and works on those and deals in those currencies. Because right now it's easy, dollar up, euro down, therefore any financial advisor's allocation in the US is typically higher to US. You're making gangbusters coming over here. But historically, since 1970, does anybody remember what the big thing that happened in 1970 was? That was one of the big ones. I'm thinking currency-wise. I'm thinking currency-wise. But it actually does affect currencies, so I'll give it. 1970 was when Nixon went off the gold standard. So we consider that big movement of when we went through a period of strong dollar to weak dollar, strong dollar, weak dollar. And it's historically been every 10 to 15 years. So why I bring that up is in our lifetimes, we will have another period where the dollar goes to weakness. Right? And if that's the case and your advisor isn't strong on being able to deal with multiple currencies, that might be a disadvantage to you. So that might be something that you would want to look for somebody that deals with cross-border types of issues. I know some guys in the US that are very strong on currencies. So it's not me saying every financial advisor in the US isn't going to be able to accomplish these things. So
I get a hold of someone here and then they help me get that stuff out of there over here.
Nice to meet you. My name's Brian. Yeah. There's ample firms that do just what we do, but most of our
pretty much how you
exactly. We have our U.S. licenses. We help tons of U.S. individuals. Our only clientele are Americans that live abroad. It's like that old commercial. I'm finding that guys on my team don't actually know this reference because I'm getting to that age. You know, I'm not just a client, I'm also the president, right? Air Club for Men. You know, the problem is that joke used to be funnier before it started to recede, right? Now it's getting literal. But essentially, that's all we deal with. These are those types of things that we deal with on a daily basis. So that's not me, is it? Good. Any other questions?
Maybe one more question. Unless you guys want to just keep going.
Yeah.
I hope this falls under no dumb question.
I really actually appreciate dumb questions because they're typically easier to answer. So, you know, I'm not going to exclude dumb questions in any way.
It probably is, and you've probably already answered it, but I'm going to ask again because I'm a slow learner. So for those of us that have not actually made the leap to move, sounds to me that you got the chicken and the egg situation. It sounds to me, once you've made it in your mind, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to move to France. I'm going to buy an apartment. I'm going to buy a house. That before you actually make that purchase, you talk to somebody like yourself in terms of the finances, so it's done in the most advantageous way in terms of dealing with it. Because when I listen to Adrian all the time, she talks about like her situation with her daughter in terms of how she structured her real estate purchases so her daughter doesn't get killed when Adrian passes. So is that what you just said, or not?
So the question is it a chicken and the egg of when do I start talking to the professionals and in what order?
Exactly in what order?
So that is so perfect because I don't think of it as a chicken and an egg. I think of it more as kind of like the last time I was here in Nice, I was doing the Nice Marathon. As you can see, it's not because I'm that athletic, it's because I challenged my nephew that if he could beat me, I'd give him 100 pounds. And I was very happy to give him the 100 pounds. But in marathon training, essentially, you start with the preparation. And that becomes the most important part. Right? It's talking to each of the professionals. It's talking to Patty and Adrian. It's talking to a financial advisor like myself, a tax accountant like Jonathan Hadida. Because once you get here on the ground, some of these opportunities like gifting get thrown out the window. The structuring of your home gets thrown out of the window after you've purchased it. It's not like the United States where you can just quick claim it over, all right? So essentially, the earlier in the build-up process, the earlier you start talking to us professionals, the easier it's going to be when you make that leap.
I think that's perfect to end on.
So don't forget to tip your waitresses. Don't forget to get more drinks. And don't forget to thank Patty, because she's been amazing at substituting for Miss Adrian.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Come.